Hello and welcome to our second lecture. In this lecture we're going to focus exclusively on the topic of gross domestic product. I can remember one of my former professors once telling us that macroeconomics is pretty much the study of gross domestic product. I remember thinking at the time, well, that doesn't sound particularly interesting if this discipline is just all about this one thing. But in fact, eventually I realised that he was right. Gross domestic product is such an important part of the macroeconomy, and moreover such an important part of the way macroeconomists think about the economy, that there is hardly a topic in macroeconomics that doesn't in one way or another involve the analysis of gross domestic product. It is absolutely front and centre to our discipline, and understanding this concept, what it is, what it measures, how the role it plays in the economy is going to be important for us in pretty much every single lecture and every single topic. What I want to do in this lecture is talk to you about what gross domestic product actually is, but moreover, I want to demonstrate for you why it's important, and why it's important in the sense that if you have a really good fundamental understanding of what gross domestic product is and what underlies the measurement of gross domestic product, you can actually start saying some pretty important, profound things about some very key macroeconomic issues. For example, have a look at this chart. This chart shows data for the United States on exports and imports. And it shows something that there's a lot of public debate about in the US, and indeed in lots of countries which are also experiencing something very similar to this. You can see from this chart that imports into the United States are invariably higher than exports. And that's true for many countries. There are many other countries for which the opposite is true. Let's just focus on this case. What you can also see from the chart is that in recent times the gap between imports and exports has widened considerably. And there's a lot of debate about this and what it actually means and where it's coming from. You'll hear some commentators say, well, this shows how inefficient US industries are. They're no longer capable of sending their products into the global market. Or you might hear that this tells us something about workers in the United States, that workers and work practices in the United States are somehow deficient relative to the rest of the world, and that explains why the gap between imports and exports has widened. And there are lots of other similar explanations or stories that are told. But in fact, there are some profound macroeconomic reasons that go way beyond that sort of superficial argument that can explain this. And indeed, by having a good understanding of gross domestic product, we can see exactly what those important fundamental macroeconomic forces responsible for this gap between imports and exports might be. In other words, if you can understand gross domestic product, you're already a long way down the road towards understanding some very important key fundamental aspects of the macroeconomy. So we'll come back to this chart in a little while after we've explored gross domestic product, and you'll be able to see exactly why it is that there is a gap between imports and exports and what the fundamental reason is for that gap and why it may have widened in recent years. Let's begin with a definition of gross domestic product. This is a fairly standard definition you see here. It measures the flow of economic activity in a geographic region, usually a country, over a particular period of time. Now, we usually think of GDP in terms of a country or a nation, but we don't have to. It is possible to think of measuring economic activity in a state or a province, but at the macroeconomic level, it's usually a country, a nation that we're thinking of. Now, this is a very broad definition of GDP, and in a moment we're going to refine this definition and make it much, much more precise. But I want to draw your attention to this word, flow, because this is a word we're going to encounter at various points during our course. In macroeconomics, we're going to deal with a large number of economic variables, GDP being one of the most important of those. Economic variables can be of two broad different types. The first is a flow, and GDP is indeed one such variable. A flow is a variable that is defined and indeed only makes sense if we think of it existing over a period of time. In your own experience, the income that you earn per week is an example of a flow. We define that variable in terms of a distinct period of time, income earned per week. And quite a few of the economic variables we'll be looking at are flows. That is, they only make sense if we think about them as occurring over a period of time. But there's a second classification of economic variables which is also going to be important for us. These are variables known as stocks. An economic variable that's a stock is defined not over time, but at a particular period of time, or if you like, at a particular point in time. In your own experience, an example of a stock might be the amount of savings deposits you have in a bank account on a particular day, let's say January the 30th. So a stock is not defined over time, it's defined at a point in time. Now, there is a relationship often between flows and stocks. Indeed, at several points in the course we're going to explore that relationship, because it is often the case that the flows we're interested in actually have the effect of building up the stocks. So in this case, it's the flow of income that enables you to increase the amount of saving that you have in your bank account. The flow is contributing to the stock. And we're going to see this interaction between flows and stocks at lots of points during the course. But we will come to that in due course. Right now, I just want to focus on this particular flow, gross domestic product. Now, the other key part of this definition, and this is actually going to be the focus for the rest of the lecture, is that it's a measure of economic activity. Now, this is a tricky concept, because what exactly do we mean by economic activity? How can we actually give that phrase a concrete meaning? And this is not at all a straightforward question to answer, because there are at least three distinct ways of thinking about economic activity. First, we can think about economic activity in terms of production. Here, we'd be looking at the flow of goods and services that are produced in an economy over a particular time period. So how much is being produced over the last 12 months? And that's a very legitimate and way of thinking about economic activity that is obviously going to be very important. But we don't have to think about economic activity as being a flow of production. We can also think about it as a flow of expenditure. How much spending is being undertaken in the economy over a particular time period? And there's a third way of thinking about economic activity. Over a particular time period in an economy, how much income has been earned? So there are three ways of thinking about economic activity. And it's not at all obvious which of those three ways is the most appropriate from the viewpoint of understanding the macroeconomy. It turns out, however, that the distinction between production, expenditure and income as measures of economic activity is not going to be as important as you might think. What I'm going to explain for you is that whilst in some sense these are quite distinct ways of thinking about economic activity, over any particular time period it turns out that these are going to be equivalent ways of thinking about economic activity. That is, over a year, let's say, if we try to measure economic activity thinking about it as a flow of production, and we then sat down and measured economic activity as a flow of expenditure, and to complete this exercise, we then calculated economic activity thinking about it as a flow of income that's being earned, you will in fact get the exact same answer. In other words, economic activity can equivalently be measured as a flow of production, expenditure and income. And it often doesn't matter which approach you take, you get the same result. Now, it's going to take a little bit of work to demonstrate that, but if you think about it logically, as we go through this, you'll see that this must be true.